city of Susa in exile under the king Xerxes. Now Xerxes, he was known for his wine, his women, his wealth, and his wrath. He loved to throw pompous parties, parading his prestige and power for everyone to see. And one of those parties lasted 180 days. One night, when he was merry with wine, he commanded that his queen come bearing her crown and displaying her beauty in front of all of his merry men. And upon her royal refusal, his wrath removed her crown and her position. But when his wine abated, he missed his queen. So the royal advisors said, "Throw a beauty pageant and go out all across the land. Gather as many virgins as you can and bring them into the king's harem." And this pleased the king. Now, in that land, there was a man named Mordecai that was living, and he was raising his young orphaned cousin, Hadassah, also known as Esther, and she was very beautiful. And when he heard about the beauty pageant, he warned her, "Tell no one, you're a Jew." And then they came, and without her consent, off to the harem she went. And each of them were required beauty treatments for an entire year. And then it came the night when she was to go to the king's bed. And he took her, and she pleased him. And he put the crown on her head instead. Now Mordecai, he would go to the king's gate, and he'd pace back and forth, hoping to catch news about Esther. And one night he overheard that two were plotting to kill the king. So he told Esther and saved the king. And it was written in the King's Chronicles, and those two fell on the gallows that day. And in the land there was another man, and his name meant celebrated one. And it was the king's command that if he passed by, you must bow. But every day when he'd go by the king's gate, Mordecai would stand tall. And some servants started to notice week after week that he would not bow. So they kept bugging Mordecai, "Why will you not bow?" And eventually he relented and said, "I'm a Jew." Well, without haste, they went to the celebrated one and they told him, and his fury would not count one out. He wanted to annihilate all of them. And so he went to the king and he offered an unforgivable sum to wipe out an entire people group. And the king waved his hand and said, "Keep your money. Do as you please." And he gave him his ring and sealed their fate on that date. And as the edict went out all across the land, the king and the celebrated one drank wine as confusion and mourning amongst the Jews filled the land. Mordecai went to the gate, ripping his clothes and wailing and crying. Esther wanted to know why. And he sent news to her. "The edict has been written. All Jews must die. You must go to the king and save our people." Well, when Esther heard this news, she felt so defeated. "Mordecai, you know the law. It says no one can enter those halls unless they're called. It's been 30 days since I've been in those walls." And he sent back word, "Do not think you're safe because you're in those palace walls. You will see the same fate. Maybe you are here for such a time as this." So Esther resigned herself. She said, "Okay, ask everyone in the land to fast for 3 days. And after 3 days, I will go. And if I die, I die. So after 3 days, she dressed in her royal robe, and she put on her royal crown, and she went before the royal throne. And to her surprise, the king was pleased with her and put out his royal scepter.
Esther, what is it you want? Up to half my kingdom, it is yours.
If it please the king, I would like to invite you and the celebrated one to my hall for a feast. And that night they went, and Esther gave them exactly what they wanted, wine and prestige. And a second time the king said, Esther, what do you want? Up to half my kingdom is yours. She said, if it please the king, I would like to invite you to my hall for a feast tomorrow. Well, that night, the celebrated one, he was so full of himself, and as he went home and passed by the king's gate, Mordecai stood tall. He was so furious, he went into his wife and his family, and he said, I have everything. I have sons, I have land, I sit at the king's table and feast with him. But if it weren't for Mordecai, that man. And so his wife and his friend said, build a gallows 75 feet tall, and let that be Mordecai's downfall. And that pleased the celebrated one. But that night, in the king's palace, he couldn't sleep at all. So he asked for the king's chronicles to be read to him. And the servant just happened to read about when Mordecai saved him.
And the king said, what was done for Mordecai?
Nothing. Nothing at all.
Who's out in the hall?
And as fate would have it, in should walk in the celebrated one to request Mordecai's downfall.
And the king said, what should I do for the one I want to honor?
And he thought, who but me would the king want to honor?
Oh, if it please the king, dress him in your royal robes, place him on your royal stallion, and parade him around town shouting, this is what's done for the one the king wants to honor. Good, do that for Mordecai.
And off he went. And he dressed him in the royal robes and placed him on the royal stallion and paraded him around town.
This is what's done for the one the king wants to honor.
And when they were done, Mordecai went back to the king's gate and sat. And the celebrated one went home in lament. And his wife and his friend said, Mordecai's going to be your downfall. And just then entered the servant.
Please come with me to Esther's hall.
And that night, Esther gave them exactly what they wanted, wine and prestige. And for a third time, the king asked,
Esther, what do you want? Up to half my kingdom, it is yours.
And she said, if you please, would you save me and my people? For an edict has been written to annihilate us all.
And the king said, in ignorance, who would do such a thing?
And Esther said, Haman, the wicked one. In an absolute rage, the king went out into the courtyard, while Haman, the celebrated one, fell at Esther's feet. And in walked the king, and he said, would you even molest my queen? And then the servant said, you know, he built a gallows 75 feet tall. He intended for Mordecai's downfall.
And the king said, let that be Haman's downfall.
And when the deed was done, his anger abated. But there was one more secret that needed to be revealed that day. And Esther said, Mordecai's my cousin. Can you please keep my people from being killed that day? But the king's signature had sealed their fate. So he gave her the ring and said, do what you must do on that fateful date. So Esther And Mordecai wrote a new edict, telling all the Jews across the land that they could fight their enemy until they were defeated. Day 1, day 2, day 3, they fought and they defeated their enemy. And then they celebrated. And to this day, all across the land, Jews everywhere celebrate the Feast of Purim. But this true story is a part of a grander story. Because see, an edict has been written against you and me. And it says the wages of sin is death. But God had a plan. He sent his son to walk on this earth, to die on a cross and rise on the third day, erasing the verdict of that sting. And now, for anyone who believes, they shall live in all eternity.